Today we're going to be looking at poetry for children. I'm going to begin with a quotation from Eleanor Farjeon. She writes, "Poetry is not a rose, but the scent of the rose, not the sea, but the sound of the sea." Poetry is less about what it is in terms of form or content, but about how it makes us feel. The indigenous people group of northern Scandinavia, the Samin, have a tradition called yoik. Yoik is a kind of poetic singing, and I think it's a really apt way of understanding poetry. One might yoik snow, improvising a song that captures the essence of the snow as it falls, but one couldn't yoik about snow. It's similar to the way one might paint snow but wouldn't paint about snow. Yoik captures a thing's essence, and poetry tries to do the same thing. Listen to this poem, Firefly July, by Patrick J. Lewis. When I was 10, one summer night, the baby stars that leapt among the trees like dimes of light, I cupped and capped and kept. That's very different from saying, I used to catch fireflies in the summer in my hands, and that's for a couple of reasons. One reason is because of connotation. Meaning is created here because of associations in the listener's mind, and not by technical or specific language. The phrase, the baby stars that leapt among the trees like dimes of light, activates your own memories of fireflies and draws comparisons between things like leaping baby stars or dimes of light, and you're able to visualize that because of the connotations of those words. The other reason that the poetic language used in Firefly July works differently than regular language or prose is concentration. There aren't a lot of words to describe what is happening, so every word has to pack a lot of punch. The difference between I cupped and capped and I cupped my hands catching the firefly and then quickly capped it so the insect couldn't escape, keeping it there where I could see it more closely, is a difference of concentration. Definitions and basics of poetry are all well and good, but how do they apply when we're talking specifically about poetry for children? Is there really any difference between children's poetry and any other poetry? Yes and no. Poetry for children calls up associations and ways of thinking that are meaningful for children. It is relevant to their lives and their emotions, but we can't forget to ask, which children? Whose lives? What kind of emotions? Does every kind of poetry resonate in the same way with every child, or every person for that matter? Of course not. One thing we can know more certainly is that poetry for children isn't the same thing as poetry about children. It's not a sappy reflection about the beauty of innocence or the joy of being carefree in some idyllic, long-lost time. Whoever the children are, poetry for them should speak directly to their lives, experiences, and ways of being in the world. So let's break down some of the parts of poetry that make that happen. One of the first essential parts of poetry, not just for children, but for anybody, is rhythm. If you've ever spent any time around really young children, you know that rhythm is a natural part of children's lives from a really early age. We tend to see them singing things or repeating things like mom, 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 ma. In poetry, the stresses and pauses that set up meter are the rhythm. So we hear it in pat a cake, baker's man. It's a very clearly defined rhythm to that kind of poetry. Another essential piece is rhyme and sound. That's also very natural in the way that children tend to speak. It's the singiness of words that can come from alliteration, assonance, or onomatopoeia. Here's a poem that does it really, really well. Listen for the sounds and the rhythm and the rhyme that make this poem sound like you're actually on a train ride. I'm taking the train to Rickety-Wick, clickety-clickety-clack. I'm sat in my seat with a sandwich to eat as I travel the trickety-track. It's an ever so rickety-trickety train, and I honestly thickety think that before it arrives at the end of the line, I will tip up my drickety-drink. I read that poem to my daughter when I was getting ready to do this presentation, and she wanted to listen to it 3 different times. When I asked her what she liked about it so much, she just said the words and the sounds. Another really essential part of poetry is imagery. That's the sensory language that creates pictures, feelings, smells, or sounds in the listener's or reader's mind. Here's a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson that does it very, very well. It's called The Eagle. He clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands. Ringed with the azure world he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. He watches from his mountain wall, and like a thunderbolt, he falls. So here we have the visual imagery of the wrinkled sea. that from how high up the eagle is, when he looks down, all of those massive waves just look like wrinkles on an azure blanket. We also have this imagery of the eagle falling like a thunderbolt. And when we say like a thunderbolt he falls, it gives so much more of an image of just that very swift descent. That's imagery. Now there's another kind of imagery that doesn't rely so much on sight as on touch and taste. And we tend to see that a lot in poetry for children because we tend to understand childhood as being a very sensory time. So listen to Peach by Rose Router. Touch it to your cheek, and it's soft as a velvet newborn mouse who has to strive to be alive. Bite in, runny honey blooms on your tongue, as if you've bitten open a whole hive. Now, the kind of imagery we have here isn't about the way that the peach looks. It's about the way that a peach feels when you touch it to your cheek, or the way that it tastes, or the sensation of the juice running over your tongue. These are all things that we can imagine and that we've maybe felt before, but they're not necessarily things that we can see. That is still imagery, and it's especially relevant to children's poetry because we imagine it to be such a sensory time. There are a couple other elements of poetry that are absolutely essential to the way that we understand it and create meaning. One is comparison and contrast. So if you've ever heard of metaphor or simile, which gets brought up a lot in American high school English classes, that's exactly what we're talking about, as well as personification. Anytime we compare two things or emphasize the ways that they're similar, we're doing comparison and contrast. You'll notice it in this poem, Geode, by John Frank. If you're not sure what a geode is, it's kind of like a round rock that when you break it open, there are crystalline formations on the inside. So it reads, I cracked a stone egg, dark as smoke, and found inside a crystal yolk as purple as a sheet of sky pulled over twilight's closing eye. So here we have comparison and contrast when we see the description of a stone egg. It's not really an egg, but it's shaped like an egg, it's similar to an egg, and it's dark as smoke. Again, we're creating a comparison. A crystal yolk, again, a direct comparison between what's found inside the geode and inside an actual egg. As purple as a sheet of sky, making a comparison between the color of presumably amethyst and the sky, pulled over twilight's closing eye. Again, we're not really talking about an eye. Twilight doesn't have an eye, but when we create that kind of imagery that compares those things, we are doing comparison and contrast. And we have one more element of poetry that I want to talk about, and that's shape. It's the way that a poem looks on the page. With capital letters at the beginning of each line, it's set into stanzas. We tend to know a poem when we see one because of the way that it looks on the page. And sometimes writers use really interesting ways of positioning their words on the page in order to create a specific effect, like we see in the next poem called Windshield Wiper by Eve Merriam. Now this is a poem that actually works better if you look at it and read it yourself than if you hear me. So this is a poem about windshield wipers, and you can see that it's arranged in two thin columns, much like windshield wipers. And there's obviously a lot of different ways to interpret it. That's a beautiful thing about poetry. But for me, when I look at these words and I see that they are very, very similar, but each windshield wiper on the page has something a little bit different. So on the left we see clear the blear, on the right we see clear the smear. They both say fog more, then on the left we have splat splat, on the right we have downpour. It reminds me of how when your windshield wipers are going, they're just like a little bit out of sync. They're mostly doing the same thing, but the sounds they make are a little bit different. And as the poem wears on, and it sounds like it's starting to get a little bit clearer, so you might turn your windshield wipers off, they sync back up again. So in this poem, the shape is really essential for kind of evoking that imagery of the way windshield wipers move mostly together, but just a little bit not. So now that we've talked a little bit about the way poems are put together, I want to talk about the potential impact that poetry can have, because the craft of the poem is not the poem. Those individual components make it what it is, but they aren't the reason for reading poetry. Because of the way that poetry taps into our sensory, emotional, associative minds, it has the potential to evoke different ways of feeling and understanding than factual prose might. Here's an example of a poem that packs a really big emotional punch. It's called Listening to Grown-Ups Quarreling by Ruth Whitman. Listening to grown-ups quarreling, standing in the hall against the wall with my little brother, blown like leaves against the wall by their voices, my head like a ping-pong ball between the paddles of their anger. I knew what it meant to tremble like a leaf. Cold with their wrath, I heard the claws of rain pounce. Floods poured through the city, skies clapped over me, and I was shaken, like a mouse between their jaws. Now there's a lot of really emotional stuff going on in this poem that can really place us in that space of being a child standing out in the hallway, listening to arguing grown-ups or arguing parents, and maybe even for some of us really remembering what it's like to be in that experience, to feel afraid as you hear that you're an adult speaking in a way that is unfamiliar and a little bit frightening. But what would the impact of distributing this poem to a classroom of 6th graders be if we just asked them to tally up the metaphors, maybe make a chart of their growing impact? Would it help them understand the construction of the poem? Sure, but would it have the same impact as hearing it read aloud and commenting on its effect or on its subject matter? Probably not. I mean, if you look at the screen in front of you, I've highlighted some of the metaphors and similes, underlined some of the imagery, and that's probably something really similar to what a lot of you were asked to do with poetry when you were in high school. But it's maybe not the most impactful way to use poetry with young people. It has the potential to make a really big impact, but its power can be stifled when we do overly technical work at a very young age. That's one reason why a lot of students groan when it's time to look at poetry. Now, much of the work involved in helping children enjoy poetry comes with choosing the right poems in the first place. And the next few slides provide some different perspectives. I'd love to hear what you think about them. So in the interest of full disclosure, I am not 100% in support of some of the information that I'm about to share, but I am making an effort to give you a sense of the current climate in which adults make decisions about and select poems for kids. So these suggestions for evaluating poetry come from OSU professors Dr. Abarba Kiefer and Cynthia Tyson. They're the authors of Charlotte Huck's children's literature. So when they're evaluating poetry for kids, they ask, does the rhythm of the poem reinforce and create the meaning of the poem? If the poem rhymes, does it sound natural or does it sound contrived? How does the sound of the poem add to its meaning? Does it use alliteration, onomatopoeia, repetition? Does the poem create sensory images of sight, touch, smell, or taste? Is imagery related to children's delight or experiences with their particular senses? And does the poem lead us to see something in a fresh, new way, or does it rely on tired cliches instead? Some other suggestions for choosing poetry for kids come from Anne Terry, who in 1974 collected data about children's poetry preferences from students in older elementary grades, and she provided these talking points. She reminds us children are the best judges of their preferences, that reading texts and courses of study often do not include children's favorite poems, so like reading books, textbooks used for school to teach reading skills, that children's poetry choices are influenced by form, poetic elements, content, humor, and familiarity, that a poem enjoyed at one grade level may be enjoyed across several grade levels, that children do not enjoy poems they do not understand, that thoughtful, meditative poems are disliked by children, that some poems appeal to one sex more than the other, and that girls enjoy poetry more than boys do, says Anne Terry. She also says that new poems are preferred over older, more traditional ones, and that literary merit is not necessarily an indication that a poem will be liked. Kiefer and Tyson also caution, teachers will not want to limit their sharing only to poems that they know children will like, for taste needs to be developed too. Children should go beyond their delight in humorous and narrative poetry to develop an appreciation for variety in both form and content. We want children to respond to more poetry and to find more to respond to in poetry. So poetry does offer readers and listeners the opportunity to connect in an emotional and meaningful way with language. It's a tool that is often used only for the practical work of direct communication. So if we can find ways to share that tool of language with humans of all ages in ways that are non-threatening and holistic, poetry really does have the potential to enrich hearts and minds.